Hey, Dale McKinley, welcome to Troublemakers.
Thank you, Phil. It's good to be here.
It's great. Today we are excited to talk about a topic that is quite universal, quite timely, but also timeless. And that's this tension in movement culture, movement life between changing the world and changing ourselves. Being the change kind of encompasses, the actions we have to take to change externally, but also internally within our struggles. And what made you decide to talk about this with me today?
My activist experience, basically a lot of the things that I've experienced as being an activist, particularly in the South African context, which has now spanned 35 years since 1990, when I arrived in this country from Zim, my home country. And my experience in being involved with mass movements and political parties, as well as social movements and others, that has been, and the experience of having many of those movements be destroyed and implode as a result of this yawning gap between what I call the personal and the political, between on one side, this really radical program, this really radical rhetoric, all sorts of promises about working class and poor people and what we want to do to change the world for the better, and equality and justice and all of these good things. And yet in that organization, my experience has been, not fully, but partially, that there is a massive gap between that rhetoric and the actual actions and the way people treat each other within movements and the relationships that they build. So oftentimes it has happened 3 times to me, both within 3 times in the Communist Party, which I was in full-time for 10 years, the Anti-Privatisation Forum, which was one of the largest social movements in this country, for another 10 years, and then the Right to Know campaign, which was another one of the largest social movements, all of which imploded, particularly around the inability, I would say, of a core group of activists to practice what they preach, to put it bluntly. And so that's why, to me, it's not a theoretical discussion. It's a very practical one that has had incredibly negative impacts on the ability to change things here in South Africa. And I have a very personal investment in this because it's been the larger part of my activist life.
We all have these experiences, where we are disappointed by people that we have cooperated with for some time, trying to achieve an ambitious goal together. Maybe we are successful in that goal even. Often people get quite disillusioned, or they feel quite betrayed when people don't, as you put it, practice what they preach. In these kind of situations, what should we do when we have comrades that are not practicing what they preach?
Well, I think the first thing is to call it out. One of the things that I became very frustrated with was the tendency, when it was very clear that somebody was being dishonest, or somebody was, for example, pilfering organizational funds on the side, and these kinds of people wanted to hush it up. They didn't want to deal with it. They were like, no, this is just part of the struggle. This is just part of what we are. We don't, otherwise it'll mess us up, or it'll give ammunition to our enemies. In other words, don't air your dirty laundry, kind of thing. So oftentimes, much like a range of other personal issues. So, for example, I can give you an example of sexual harassment that was going on within the movement, and most of the comment when we raised this, most of them wanted to just not deal with it. They just did not want to deal with it, just sort of bypass these things. So I think the first thing is to surface it, to have an open and honest conversation. This is what it is. How do we go about collectively then approaching this? What do we do? Maybe it doesn't require disciplinary processes or formal things. Maybe it's just about talking to people or about having conversations together. But if you don't allow that to happen, then it festers. And it oftentimes then comes out in very negative ways. So I think that's the first thing. Then once you do that, depending upon who's involved and what the nature of it is, you can then engage in what I would call democratic collective processes of dealing with these things in a meaningful way. To me, any serious organization has to have in place mechanisms to deal with things where people abrogate the principles and values of the movement. And oftentimes, all the organizations I had those, but they were not followed. So they simply were not followed. And as a result, it blew up eventually and imploded the organization.
One of the tensions in social movement culture is sort of between this aspect of spontaneity and sort of improvisational life and needing to put those mechanisms and accountability norms and values and things like that very expressly articulated, needing to create a culture of clarity around how do we resolve our conflicts and our issues. Most of the stuff happens in the in-between. We're trying to build those systems and practices. We're also reacting every day to these different things that are arising. We're improvising. There's a lot of spontaneity in movement life. And in that vacuum, anybody who is abusive or a thief or just dishonest kind of has an opportunity, wouldn't you say, to exploit the lack of clarity?
Indeed. And that's precisely what happened. Was if it's not dealt with or if it's not surfaced and openly confronted, then it festers. It grows like a weed, basically, with in and amongst the flowers, which of course there are. There's a lot of good things that are happening in the movements. People are doing struggles. And then, but what it also tends to do is it's a very insidious kind of process, because if people who, building a movement is getting people on board, convincing people of ideas, of the need for change, of the need for collective action, of the need to do certain things. And that is only successful to the extent that you can convince people to trust you, that they want to be part of a collective, that they believe what you're saying, and they believe you're going to do these things. And when they see the opposite within the movement and organization, they turn their backs and they leave. And it undermines the fundamental basis of building a movement, which is to build power, and I mean power in the most holistic sense of that, not in terms of political, economic power, but people's power, and effectiveness. And that's, as a result of that, what happens is those what I call just people sometimes who are simply opportunists, agents provocateurs. We uncovered 5 paid informants of the National Security Agency within our movements. As a result, and we knew that they were coming into meetings and particularly causing and doing
Right.
things. So, but beyond
It's
that,
malicious and intentional.
but beyond that, there were just people who they should have been dealt with, could have been done, but people sort of put it aside, and as a result, it grows like a cancer, and then it undermines gradually the movement, both from I think a perspective of growth, but also a perspective of legitimacy.
In one movement that I was a part of, which had various kind of organizations attached to it, like, kind of registered official organizations that were a part of it, we had a person who was being quite dishonest with money, unclear about their relationships with the state, and people were beginning to suspect this person. Because we didn't have concrete evidence, per se, we stalled a bit in terms of dealing with it, or even calling it into conversation. We didn't quite know how to go about it. And that stalling bothered a lot of the members. They felt like if we're not going to address this, if we're not going to take it seriously quickly, like their morale depleted and their thirst to attend meetings and take actions together and things like that. We could see the morale of the entire movement kind of slowing down. There's a lot of ambiguity, I would say, in these. This is like a nebulous gray area sometimes.
Sometimes it can be. I agree with you, and it can be difficult. But other times it's very clear. And I think where the nebulousness and where the gray areas often come and where you can have debate is when what I call people use particular political tools or political rhetorical means of trying to essentially get what they want, to try through other means. So, for example, here in South Africa, where we have fairly deep racial and class cleavages in society, ethnically, because of the history of apartheid, it's very easy for someone who wants to come into an organization and to find ways to do things that they shouldn't be doing by playing the race card, by playing the ethnic card, by playing the gender card, and doing so in a pseudo-radical way.
Right.
And so, they appear as though they're being radical. We will not work with people who are white, for example. Well, okay, if you're trying to build a movement in this country, or we will not work with people who are Zimbabweans, or we will not, whatever it might be. So in that context, I think oftentimes that grayness results, because then people say, but there's legitimacy in that. There's people are making points that are legitimate, but in the end, what those are just rhetorical means to get to an end, which is to basically get a position, get the money, get whatever it is, and in the process, you sort of, as you say, people become disillusioned, people become just tired. They become tired of all the shit.
Yeah,
So
navigating all those
all
these
kinds
complexities.
of absolutely, and then, but there's others that are very clear. Let me give you a good example.
Sure.
In the APF, which had 39 community affiliates, was the largest social movement at the time, massively powerful. We had 4 different organizers, and 3 of them were males, young males. And long story short, we were approached by a sex worker who accused all 3 of them of raping her in a hostel at night. So we started our own investigation, and we suspended the comrades initially, and we eventually found them guilty. But when we publicly pulled this up and we issued a public statement saying this is what's happened in our movement, this is how we're dealing with it, the backlash from other comrades and other organizations, how can you say these things about these comrades? We know them very well. How can you do this? This should have been dealt with internally otherwise. And as we expelled them eventually because they were guilty.
Yeah.
And they were, and certainly it was clear to us from our investigations. But as a result of that, what happened was they mobilized camps within the movement to protect them. It split things. It started fights all over an issue which was 3 men raped a woman. And therefore, what happened as a result of them playing all this radical politics and other things, it made it seem that it wasn't as cut and dried as that when it was. And so doing the right thing, doing the principled thing, was hugely costly for the movement. If we'd have just buried this, if we'd have just done it internally, well, then you just paper it over. And that's what happens most of the time, unfortunately.
People kind of default toward that political expediency instead of the values and what is right and just.
And so I think and this gets to the fundamental point of why I wanted to talk about this, is that I always say this: why are we activists in the first place? Why do we see something in front of us and we don't like it, we want to change it. As simple as that, right? Whatever that might be.
Right.
In our society, in our community, in our whatever it is. And then we either join something, we try to do something. Underlying that desire to change something is usually, on a progressive, I'm not talking about the right wing here, we're talking about progressive, is equality, justice, honesty, ability, to collectivities, all these kinds of principles and values that are infuse what we do. And to me, if we don't hold those dear, and if we don't hold them, we all make mistakes. We're all not going to be able to adhere to everything all the time. But if we try as best we can to follow that both individually and organizationally, then we can move forward. But when we have so many, instances where people are not doing that, not only does it implode the movement itself, but it delegitimizes a progressive agenda. So it has much larger so I can give a lot of examples here in South Africa where this has played itself out with big men leaders in unions who are revolutionary and who are feted around the world in conferences and everything else, and yet they've been accused of sexually harassing all sorts of women and acting in really nasty ways to political but nobody wants to talk about that.
Right.
So that's the problem, is and then when I say we don't practice what we preach, it's fundamentally because, to me, what has happened in South Africa, in my country here for the last 35 years, a significant portion of why we're in the situation we're in is not simply because of the neoliberals and the capitalists and the imperialists and everybody. It's because of us.
Mm.
It's because of the failures and the unwillingness to confront these realities and to be honest about them. And therefore, people have lost trust. They don't listen to the left anymore. They say you're just full of shit, because you say one thing and you do another.
Mm.
You go and talk about gender-based violence, and then you go beat up your girlfriend.
Right.
That would be a classic example.
Yeah.
But this is why, to me, it's fundamental to everything that we do as activists, as progressives, as something is, and it's it's not an easy thing. If there's anybody that should be disillusioned, I would say it's me. 30 years of absolutely hard work in building movements, all three of which have basically not, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. We're not talking about small community organizations. We're talking about things that had a chance to change this country's trajectory. And yet here we are, but we continue because that's what we believe.
So you also can't say that these movements that you've been organizing with haven't accomplished anything.
Not at all.
Certainly, they've moved the needle in some way or another.
Absolutely.
So this is one of the interesting things I think about this conversation is that, both on the personal front and the political front, if we're to kind of package it like that, we are moving forward together with contradictions.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. I would just sort of supplement that by saying we could move a lot faster together if we confronted some of those contradictions more honestly and more directly. And I think, so there's always going to be those, yes. There's always going to be these hiccups. There's always going to be things where people disappoint us, where people don't do, and that damage our organization or our struggles or whatever it is. That's going to happen all the time. My point is, how do we deal with it? It's going to be there. It's not something you can wish away.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we deal with it? And I think that our political and organizational culture has a lot to answer for. Because my sense is, at least in my experience here in South Africa, I can't speak for other organizations, but here is that we've had a culture that is basically one of, hear no evil, speak no evil, see no, kind of thing inside the organization. You just don't deal. You don't air that dirty laundry. You don't talk about it openly because it's better, because it's always about confronting the enemy outside and making sure. And so these things are papered over, and it's much like a personal relationship. An organizational relationship. If you start having problems with communication and you start having problems with trust and other kinds of things, and you let it, fester, it's going to eventually end the relationship. We know this. And the same thing happens organizationally. So it's not so much that to try to say we can have a nirvana or we can have a situation where we don't have any of these contradictions. It's how we deal with the contradictions.
Right.
And I think that's the area where I think there's massive room for improvement. Yeah.
And it comes down more to the internal culture of the movement rather than maybe like the kind of rigid mechanisms of how you're going to deal with it.
Yeah, look, I mean, you can have your disciplinary procedure, you can have your internal processes, yes, but it's about building, fundamentally, what our struggles are about building relationships. Different kinds of relationship with those that we work with, or we struggle with, relationship with others that we want to influence, relationship with other, and building those relationships, particularly in the core of your organization, your movement, has to be based upon some degree of just like a personal relationship on trust. And, and this is what was so, let me give you a personal example of myself in the Communist Party. This was a time in the 1990s when the Communist Party was in government. Half the ministers were Communist Party members. I was an elected of the largest district and here in Johannesburg of the Communist Party here, and a member of the provincial executive. And as a result of ideological battles between those that were selling out the working class and wanting to go the neoliberal route and implementing privatization and others, and those of us here, we had a head-on collision. And what happened is that those of us who were in trying to stick to our principles and values about the working class were offered positions in government to keep quiet.
Mm.
Myself and one other individual out of our collective were the only two that refused. Everybody else. And so in some ways, and that you pay high prices for that because you get excluded from those things.
Right.
But what went on as a result of those kinds of things, the party itself became a party of corruption, of private. It just became a joke as far as I was concerned, as a communist party, as a left force. But it did so much damage in the process to the cause of progressive struggle that it's one of those things that's hard to overcome, because money and power, whether they're small or they're large, tend to in conditions of material desperation and of inequalities tend to be very powerful weapons that can be utilized.
Do you have any examples of a time when some egregious act existed within the movement and other comrades were able to address this act in a way that brought everybody back together stronger?
Yes. The early years of the Anti-Privatisation Forum, when we were all together, where we had unions involved, we had students involved, we had communities involved, and what happened was the unions, which were members of COSATU, basically came and said, we don't want to be part of the APF anymore because you're too critical of our alliance partner, the ANC, which was in government, the ruling party. And as a result, they pulled out and they started trying to attack the APF and to undermine it and basically, and as opposed to sort of like having an all-out war, everything, what we did is we said, listen, we concentrated on those things that made connections with the workers, and we started relationships with the rank and file as opposed to the leadership. So we kept on board the union power where it was, with people who were really interested, and we bypassed the leadership in many of these unions and said that's not really what
We don't need
not
the
about
Secretary General. We have the shop stewards and the workers themselves.
and who live in our communities, who live in the very communities that are we organizing. So we made common cause with ordinary people and ordinary workers, and as a result, we're able to move beyond what would have been otherwise a major sort of split or block between supposed unions and students and communities. And the way we did that was to make the connections between worker interests and worker struggles and community struggles and everything else, and say this is what counts, not what official positions the union takes or the politics of government or whatever. Yeah.
Do you have any examples of core members of any of these struggles that have been willing to listen and learn when they've maybe been abusive or harmful in some way?
Yes, the Right to Know campaign, which was an access to information, freedom of expression movement that we built, which was quite a different animal in its way, a multi-class organization. And what we had initially was this clash. We had sort of, your hardcore working class activists coming in and clashing with middle class people who didn't have the same ideological and material and other kind of historical things, and would attack them all the time, on the basis of these things. And so as a collective, the way we dealt with that was to try to bring them together and start saying, let's talk to each other about life and about commonalities instead of differences, and how we can work together and do these things. And as a result, many of those comrades who had previously been absolutely opposed to being a much more inclusive organization and bringing on board a whole range of other people said, yes, this is how we build an organization, and became very, very inclusive themselves and more tolerant and more accepting as a result of the way we approach this in terms of trying to concentrate on the commonalities of what we were and not on the differences.
Two of the areas where I've experienced these internal challenges that you're describing within our struggles are related to one that you've mentioned a few times already, which is sexual harassment or gender-based violence. That's quite a common one. The other one that I see quite often is this kind of accusation that if we're fighting corruption, we can't be corrupt. Mishandling of money. Money is a very tricky thing.
Very.
Even when we have very institutionalized, organizations and things like that, and we have an entire employed finance department, and then there's annual audits. People still figure out how to embezzle and cook the books and all that kind of thing. Um, what are some of what are we like? What are some of the main kind of areas that I've not mentioned that seem particularly, kind of volatile within movement life?
In my experience here, outside of what we've just talked about,
Yeah.
racial tensions.
Mm.
This South Africa, of course, we need no explanation for how deep those racial divisions have gone, and it's always a challenge to try to bring, and racial and ethnic. So it's not just racial, but apartheid was not just dividing people according to color; it divided people according to their ethnicity. So all the homelands were separate according to what language, and this still, you go out into the townships, so it's still organized oftentimes, and people live in areas which are linguistically homogenous. The Zulu speakers are there, the Tswana speakers are here, the Sotho speakers are here. And so bridging those ethnic and racial gaps within a movement is challenging, because oftentimes people come with a lot of that feeling of not having been in spaces where there are other people that are not like that, So when you create a progressive, inclusive space, all of a sudden people have to try to get to know somebody different who speaks a different language, or who looks different than you, or who comes from a different material background, as opposed to just a community organization. So that has been a huge challenge. We've successes and failures at the same time, but it's there. It's something that is embedded in the society structurally, and so it's always going to be surfacing. And it's the question again of how you deal with that, and the kinds of relationships that you can build that don't try to dismiss those realities, but basically try to create a situation where they can complement each other as opposed to being in conflict.
Yeah, so there's that responsibility of building a certain kind of culture with intention within the movement. But then there are also these situations where you might have racism arise. And as a white person from Southern Africa, how do you have any wisdom about how you've been able to successfully or not so much position yourself in these kind of situations to bring about, better understanding, better healing, confronting issues of racism?
Yes, I do. And in fact, I would say that for the most part, in all the movements, but despite all of the problems, despite all of the craziness, on a personal level, I think it's only happened maybe once or twice, and that was in the old Communist Party days when things were getting very nasty, where the racial component has been played to me. And the reason why I think that's the case, it's so rare, is because my approach has been that I believe that most people will judge me on what I do, not what I look. Okay? It's what I do. And when you're in a movement and people over time can see that, they can see how you respond to them. They can see what work you do. They can see you're committed. They can see that you don't discriminate. They can see then that's you build a human relationship that then tends to overcome those racial and ethnic. You begin to make connections with people. And that's, to me, has been the key thing. It's not because I say certain things. It's not because I write very well, or because I speak very well, or whatever it is. It's because of every day you're doing certain things that people can see and say, that person is who they say they are, or that person I can count on, or that person I can deal with and I can establish a relationship with. You might not agree on everything, but that's okay. And that, to me, has been the core foundation for building the kinds of relationships that, irrespective of all the other things we've talked about, have sustained themselves. And I have to say, I'm quite proud of that fact, because in a context where the racial divisions are so deep, it's very rarely played itself out in my personal life. It has on occasion, but very rarely. And I think that I like to think that one of the reasons why that's the case is because people are judging me on the basis of what they see and what they do on a daily basis.
How do you position yourself when a fellow white person, if I'm to use that phrase,
Sure.
consciously or unconsciously commits some kind of act of racism that's harmful, and of course in this situation you're also a white person, you might be with a lot of black comrades. Do you have some principles for how you might behave in such a situation?
Absolutely. The first and foremost thing is you have to speak out. You have to confront it there and then. You cannot let it pass. That is crucial. Once you let
The
it
moment
pass,
matters.
the moment matters. The very moment when someone says something, just like it would be if it's a racist comment, if it's a sexist comment that is meant or demeaning, undermining of someone's dignity, ethnic or whatever, it has to be confronted right then and there. You have to speak. You have to say. That's my experience, and that's how I've always approached it. It's got me into a lot of trouble because people will respond, and obviously they might respond quite virulently, and on a couple of occasions quite violently, physically as well, where somebody got so upset. But to me, that's the fundamental prerequisite, is to be able to do it. And then once you've done that, is to then be able, if it's in an organizational setting or in with other comrades, is to talk about it. Is to say, how, this is something that we will not accept. This is something we will not, and so to make it clear to people that this is unacceptable behavior, and if it happens again, then these kinds of things, we collectively agree that this is the way we'll approach it. So it becomes something that's not an individualized issue, and it's not something that you're responding to because you're white or because you're of this particular, you're lesbian or gay, as opposed to being heterosexual or whatever it is. It's because you're trying to build a community that is inclusive, and in order to do that, you've got to act that way, and you've got to speak that way, and you've got to confront those things. And just like you would if you saw someone stealing money right in front of you and taking organizational money, if you turn the blind eye, well then, yeah,
right,
don't say anything. It's the same thing, I think, on that.
The best chance to rectify the act of theft is to stop the thief from stealing the money,
and to call out the bigots, to call out the racists, to call out the xenophobes.
So Dale, we've covered a lot of ground in a short time. What would you like to say about this topic that you've not said already?
I would just, I think if anything, I would just like to say, for those people who oftentimes are very disappointed and disillusioned, hang in there. Hang in there. I'm about to turn 65, and it's amazing. And I'm still going strong after 40 years within these movements of a lot of disappointments, a lot of things. But what keeps me going and what keeps those struggles going is that in the middle of all of these things we've talked about, there is that principled value, honesty, ordinary people doing things all the time, amazing you, building positive relationships. This is what is most important. And despite
it's actually the sweet stuff of life in general, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's those very simple things, and small little victories and small little things that keep you going and make it count and can overcome all of the other stuff. So that's my message. That's what I would like to say.
Thanks so much for joining us on Troublemakers.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hi! We hope you enjoyed the conversation on this episode of Troublemakers and feel inspired to stir up some good trouble in your own community. Do feel free to check out our other episodes and subscribe to Troublemakers Podcast in your preferred podcast app. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook as troublemakers.podcast for all the latest updates, behind-the-scenes content, and sneak peeks of what's coming next. We also love to hear from our listeners. You can email us via troublemakersthepodcast@gmail.com or simply drop a DM through our social media. And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, take a moment and share it with a friend or leave us a review. It really helps us grow our community of troublemakers. Keep shaking things up.